This conference will now be recorded.
Okay, welcome to our first session of Great Books of the Western World. This is going to be taught by myself and Luke. We're going to be reading through some important literary works. Some of them have something to do with theology. Some of them have nothing to do with theology, like the one we're going to be talking about tonight. I guess it kind of has something to do with theology, but not Christian
Mm,
theology. Is that
right.
fair? Yeah.
Yes,
Um,
definitely.
so Luke is going to start off by kind of giving us an overview of the class, and he's also going to talk a little bit about a book called The Great Conversation, which, if you have the physical copies of Great Books of the Western World, this is volume one, correct?
Right.
Okay,
Right.
go ahead.
Yeah. Yes. Well, the series was put together by Encyclopedia Britannica. Actually, they're the ones that printed this originally. And the author, one of the men that was involved in putting the series together and choosing which books would go into this collection, was also involved in writing sort of an essay, basically kind of a long essay, and it was put into the form of the first book, kind of the introductory volume to the series, and it was called The Great Conversation. And what they do is they kind of lay out the philosophy behind, first of all, why they're putting the series together and why they're using those particular books and what they mean for the Western world. So the basic thing that is introduced in that book, in that first volume, The Great Conversation, is kind of a lament concerning the loss of liberal education in Western culture. And liberal education is defined essentially as uh, kind of, we would think about it as the humanities, but basically that type of knowledge and learning which isn't immediately materially practical, as in it won't necessarily help you, get a better career or something like that, but it's something which is uh, basically, I would say, good for the soul. The deep philosophical questions that people have grappled with, and that sort of thing, and perhaps even the literary and historical ones. And so that was sort of the rationale for beginning this, because they thought it was a real detriment for Western culture that we were losing liberal education, and that our education was beginning to focus so much on basically how to make a living that they forgot how to live, and how to live a good life, and how to be a human being. And so that was basically the idea of presenting these great books. That has been the primary quest from, well, really from Greek times all the way through to, I would say, to about the 1800s in even in the United States. It was um, the pursuit of not just, living a comfortable economic life and that sort of thing, or even necessarily or solely learning the truths of philosophy in order to have, a well-run state. But more fundamentally than that, it was how to be a good person. And so you do that by thinking about, the deep questions that everyone needs to answer for themselves, and simply by thinking in general too, just by making sure that you as a soul don't remain stagnant, so that you're always growing. And that, interestingly, they mention this too in this introductory book. That ideal really can it corresponds well to the Christian worldview. And as a matter of fact, I would say that if it weren't for the Christian worldview, I don't think a collection like this ever would have been made. Definitely, like Quentin mentioned, a lot of the books in this series were written by Christians, written by Christian philosophers. A lot of it actually has to do with theology, specifically Christian theology. So these are the types of books which have influenced us to a great degree. And that's the other element too, is that these the particular books that were picked were books that have had a really uh, a, a large effect on our culture, whether you know it or not. And that's the interesting thing. I think a good reason why someone or anyone really ought to read these books is because a lot of these ideas you will have come across before, just in different forms. And I'm taking this class with Amridge right now on um, church history, And the teacher mentioned this really interesting idea. He called it, it's his kind of his, I know the term used in economics as well, but he called it this trickle-down theory, which is that a lot of the ideas that you hear, just the preacher at your church talk about, a lot of them will have come to him from some of these great men in their writings. That's kind of where they would have been started. The preacher himself may not know that's where they come from. He may have, I got that from my teacher, let's say at school, but that teacher got it probably from, from one of those great books as well. And so that's true for theology and in the church. But regarding the entire Western culture as a whole, a lot of our fundamental ideas and worldviews have come from a lot of these books that are put into this collection, the Great Books series. And so that's a really, just on a historical basis, it's a good reason to learn about them and to read them. But you'll also find that all the questions you've ever had about life are asked and answered in these books, and a great deal of them that you never even thought to ask. A lot of the questions are asked. I don't know if they're always necessarily answered, but anyway, that's the basic idea for it. And anyway, to kind of conclude that, the great conversation is an interesting term. I've thought about it a lot. And as it's presented in that introductory volume, it's the idea that there are common questions, and obviously the common human condition, which is something we all at least implicitly understand. And people throughout history, great minds have tried to ask and answer some of the great questions of science and of philosophy and of theology, questions about man and questions about God. And so essentially what any individual, ordinary person can do by reading these books and talking about the ideas with people is you can join this great conversation which has been going on since, for thousands of years and will hopefully continue on before us. And that's where the imperative comes in, because the problem for us is we're starting to lose our culture as it was. And the reason is because we're starting to lose touch with a lot of these ideas which have been presented to us in these books. And that's more the case now than it ever was. These books were originally printed by Encyclopedia Britannica in the early 1950s, and they were talking about this problem even then. And we can see how much worse it's gotten now, how far away we've gotten from where we've come from intellectually. And so it's an important thing to really read these books. Anyway, that's a basic summarization with a few personal thoughts on the series and on the introductory volume.
And another thing is the order that these books go in, I think, is something important, that it has a flow of how Western thought has developed, that it doesn't, it has, we don't start off with Hume or something like that.
Right.
We start off with the basics and they build on it. That way, when we get to those type of later figures, we can address, well, a lot of times what they'll say will follow what their argument is, but maybe their presuppositions are wrong. So if you go back and analyze something we had read previously, we can address it. He's right about what he's saying, but what he's failing to take into consideration is X, Y, or Z that was talked about by Augustine, something like that.
Right, and that's particularly going to be true in some of the books that focus more on some of the sciences. Like I noticed we have Galen as one of our writers to read, and of course he was one of the earliest. He was a scientist of sorts and a doctor, and he's pretty sure the guy who had the idea of the different types of fluids that people have in their bodies, and when you're sick, it's because one of those fluids is deficient. You've probably heard that before. So you'll find some of those ideas.
We could talk about the humors being out of balance when we get there. I will. Granted, yes, they had no clue what they were talking about, but it was because their presuppositions were wrong. Their ideas and reasonings a lot of times actually had something behind it that makes sense based on other things in the body. So we'll talk about that when we get there.
Right. And on a general level, which would apply to all of these books, you'll find that, of course, all of these investigations are based on the empirical evidence that you have at the time, which that will change and that will improve over time. So it's interesting, and it's important that something like that, like Galen and all the other books, are in there. We might look at it and laugh, but essentially they are who we talk about when we say we're dwarfs standing on the shoulders of giants. We can see higher than they can. but it's only because of the basis that they provided for us. So.
Right. I mean, without his work, we would never have Pasteur's germ theory work,
Hmm.
which,
Right.
and I think that's one of the major things that we see whenever we look at a series like this, of just how people built on each other's ideas as things went along.
Hmm. You have to be wrong a lot before you can be right,
Yeah.
I suppose.
All right.
So,
So
all right.
our first book that we're going to discuss is the Iliad by Homer,
Hmm.
and maybe do you have any comments on the author Homer to start out with, or the Homers, or however you want to discuss?
Well, uh, no, not particularly. Well, the only thing that stands out to me about him initially that I think is important is that he was reportedly blind,
Hmm,
and that that's an interesting thing, um, because so of course this will become more interesting when we talk about the Odyssey, because there was also a blind poet
right.
uh, and bard in that one as well. I thought that was interesting. That might be something we might talk about more later.
Autobiography.
Yes,
Yeah.
perhaps. But either way, that's the interesting thing to me, was that he was purportedly blind, and there's really not much really that we know about him. Other than that, as far as I'm concerned, that's not much. That's about all I know about him. But I know
I
there's not
have.
much about him.
There is kind of this. I've at least seen a few people who make it kind of the same argument that you have with Shakespeare, that maybe there was not an actual Shakespeare, there were multiple
Uh,
Shakespeares. I've heard the same
hmm
thing of Homer. Um,
hmm,
I don't know if there's any truth to that, but I guess it is kind of an interesting idea.
yeah,
Besides the Bible, this is the most well accounted book in the ancient world, which I think
right,
it kind of speaks to the impact that it had at the time.
right. Well, now that you mention it, I did have that thought while I was reading it. I didn't know there was an actual theory surrounding. I mean, I assumed, but I didn't know particularly about any of them regarding, I guess the textual criticism of the books. But I did notice that some of the stories were a little bit repetitive, and that often will indicate that perhaps they come from different sources. That's a
Right.
possibility, at least. So it's entirely possible. I suppose there's
Maybe.
only so much we can know about that. So,
True. I will say that we do see that sometimes in the Old Testament too, like whenever
right,
um, Abraham's servant went to find a wife for Isaac, how the story gets told three times in less than a chapter. So
right,
it was a little bit of how they told stories back then too.
true, true.
So let's
So
start
yeah,
off with the setting. Give me the setting of the Iliad. Set me up for the world that we're stepping into.
okay. Well, you're stepping into ancient Greece essentially, and that would be um, I don't. Let's see. I guess I don't have a particular year or like set of years I could put it in. Do you know a
Well,
spectrum
because
of the dates?
my understanding is, since the Trojan War isn't actually, like, this is the best account that we have of the Trojan War, that no
Right.
one's quite sure. Um,
Gotcha. Yeah.
yeah,
Uh,
but
well,
the Trojan War, I think if we say the Trojan War, I think that's enough.
right. Right. It's definitely very ancient. That's the interesting thing to me, and that's something which is the most obvious, is because we're going to get to Plato in this series, and I've read much of Plato before anyway, and I know that he mentions him quite a lot. And I know that Plato was writing in, I think, the fourth or fifth century BC, and so that's what you might say like classical times, of the beginning, maybe close to the beginning of the classical period. But this uh, book, the Iliad, written by Homer, is much older than that. It's ancient, and so you're talking, I would say, I would hazard to say, 1,000 to 1,500 years before Christ. You're talking about some of the foundational literature of the Greek peoples. So it's not just something they kind of, um, I mean, the Greek people as a nation, that is, as a kind of unified identity, because obviously the people they're talking about here were already known as Greeks. But it's interesting too, because you have different names for them the Danaans was one of them, or the Achaeans is one that's mentioned a lot, but they all kind of refer to the same basic groups of people. But you can tell even by looking at it that they're not anywhere near a unified nation at that point in the story. So you're talking about very early times before Greece was Greece as we know it from classical history. So very old time. You've got kind of a sort of a tribal type of system, it seems, because it's sort of maybe kind of like city states. You have people that are kind of in charge of different areas, and they're focused around cities. And you essentially have warlords. That's kind of what it struck me as, when even from looking at, regardless of the comments on it historically from scholars, if you look at the book itself, you see, Menelaus, who's the king of Sparta, and you've got Agamemnon, and he's got his kingdom. You've got Odysseus from Ithaca, and you've got all these people from all over the place, and they kind of have their men with them, and as a matter of fact, another thing which they reminded me of was sort of, they're a little Viking-esque sometimes. You know what I mean? Like they will get together and they'll go raiding, and they'll just kind of plunder cities and get women and treasure and take it back to their lands after a time, and they'll sail to different places to do that. And so it's an interesting world that you enter into. It's a kind of foreign world in that sense, that it's something obviously we're not familiar with historically or personally, but that's basically the type of world you're entered into, is ancient Greece before Alexander the Great, before Greece becomes this mighty empire and that sort of thing, where it's a bunch of like individual individual tribes and warlords and that sort of thing. So
okay, so
and the oh yeah, go ahead. Sorry. Oh, I was just going to say the basic setting, of course, is the city of Troy. And the city of Troy is on the western coast of modern-day Turkey, essentially. You've got Asia Minor, that's kind of where it is. So it's across the water, it's across the Aegean Sea from Greece. And you've got the people from Greece coming over to it, and that's kind of where the setting is they're trying to take Troy. And I guess, well, yeah, that's where I'll stop for now until you kind of ask me some more, I guess. That's a good, basic setting for it. It's the city of Troy.
So the kind of, we think about, our plot of story. You have our introduction, our exposition area, and we have our problem, rising action, climax, falling action, and then resolution.
Right.
I found the exposition kind of odd in this. Can you talk a little bit about this argument with Agamemnon and Achilles that kind of opens up the book? I just found this interesting, that this is how this story starts.
Yes, what essentially is going on is they had just, let's see, do you remember, look at my book again, because it's been a while now since I actually read the first part. I can't remember exactly what they had just taken. They had just like looted a city. Do you remember what the city was?
I can't remember the name of the city, but
gotcha.
the result I think is more interesting, but go ahead.
Right. So essentially what happens is they had just looted a city, and they had their treasure from it and the women that they had taken. And Agamemnon is punished essentially by the gods because he failed to offer a sacrifice. He kind of messed up as far as that goes, even against some of his comrades' advice. And so he's kind of in trouble. And so, as a matter of fact, let me see. Sorry, I'm trying to look at my particular volume because I had a note written down regarding that particular question. But basically, Agamemnon is compelled to restore one of these captive girls to her father. Her name was Chryses, I think it was, Chryses. Her father was a priest of Apollo, I think it was. Mm-hmm. And so he decides he's going to take her back and give her back to her father. And of course, the problem with that is that this girl belonged at this point to Achilles. He's the one that had taken her. Oh, I'm sorry, I actually got that fact mixed up, didn't I? The fact is, well, the truth is that Agamemnon is kind of angry about having to give this girl back. Agamemnon is the one that had this girl, and he's kind of mad at Achilles. And so what he does is, in retaliation, he takes Briseis, which is Achilles' woman, from him. And Agamemnon, kind of being the head of this pack here, he's allowed to do that, and Achilles is really mad with him, and so he basically decides, they're going to go and try and fight Troy and conquer Troy, the city of Troy, and he's like, well, I'm not going to help.
Right.
And essentially he has this kind of a hissy fit.
Basically, it's Achilles did all the work in sacking the city.
Right.
And
True.
And Agamemnon takes his prize, kind of in quotation marks, his prize.
Right.
And Achilles is left with nothing. And when you've got basically your best warrior that you've upset him, now you want to go fight Troy, which is, my understanding, a much bigger task than this one they had fought previously. That just seems like bad warfare and bad business to me. But anyway.
Right. Big ego, that's for sure.
All right. So that's how we're introduced to our characters through this kind of skirmish between Agamemnon and Achilles, who are probably the two best warriors on the sides of the Achaeans. Would you say that's true?
Yes. Yes, definitely.
Okay. So from there, is there any other important characters at this point, do you think, that Odysseus is here, which is, the main character of the next book we'll talk about, but he doesn't play a huge role in this book.
True. He's a supporting actor, I guess you would say. Right. Yes, definitely. But it is interesting. There are two characters which I think are important. Odysseus being one of them, and the reason is, well, Troy itself is almost a character in that like we said, it's the setting for the book, and it's interesting because Troy is, it's the central, I guess, the focal point for a lot of different, I guess, the different peoples that have become famous from the Mediterranean area, and their stories and the ideas that accompany them. So you have Odysseus, of course, which his story becomes told in the Odyssey, and that is his story as he's leaving Troy. So it's all kind of focused around Troy there. But then there's another character which was used by a later poet to do kind of a similar thing. His name is Aeneas, and he's on the side of the Trojans. He came to Troy to help defend Troy, and he's not that big of a character in this book either, but he is mentioned several times, and he does a few things. He kills a few people. But in the Iliad, which is another book that's in our series, written by what was his name of all times? Now I can't remember his name. He was the Roman poet. Anyway, that book, the Aeneid, is the story written much later, of course, in Roman times. Was written about Aeneas and his return from Troy, and he lived in basically what is now Italy, or what became, the central part of the Roman Empire. So that's kind of the Roman origin story. One of them is Aeneas's return back from Troy. So you see these characters, and they all kind of have their beginnings here. But there's a lot of other traditions that accompany all these people, and they all are kind of together in this one great battle at Troy. And from Troy, they all kind of have their own stories, and that forms, I think, on a psychological level too. It has kind of formed that world as we know it historically today. It's the basis. And as far as, I guess, the myth goes, as far as the myth is concerned, the central myth for both the Romans and the Greeks and everyone in that area kind of starts here at Troy. That's the first that everyone really knows about it. That's where the myth starts to meet history too, because there seem to have been some real events attached to this. But anyway, that's how much significance this book has. Is it has these characters, and they're here, and they're all kind of together, but they all have their own stories. And from this story, theirs kind of span outward.
So we cross the Achaeans, we cross over to Troy, and we start off with kind of a David and Goliath style skirmish. Tell me a little bit about that.
Right. Let's see. Are you? One second. Now, are you referencing?
Ajax.
I don't know what you're talking about. Oh yes, okay. Ajax and.
Is it Paris?
Wait, who'd you say? In Paris, yes, that's it. Oh, that's right. See, we should have done this earlier while I had just read it, because I'm reading the Odyssey now. So some of the names I get mixed up with. But yeah, Ajax and Paris. Well, of course, the whole thing, and this is really it's interesting, especially having watched the movie Troy, having certain expectations of what the book will have. And there are two things that were very essential in that they showed in the movie Troy, with Brad Pitt, that they didn't actually have as going on in the book. It's talked about in the book, but two things that aren't mentioned. One is, of course, the reason why they're there at Troy in the first place. They mention it, but they don't show it, which is that Paris had taken Helen, who was the wife of Menelaus, from Sparta and taken her back with him to Troy. And Paris was one of the sons of the king of Troy, and so he that's where he goes, and he goes there, and that wasn't. It's kind of like that problem is already in existence, and the reader is kind of expected to have already known about that story, and to know, okay, this is why everyone's there. So Ajax is one of these warriors from the side of the Achaeans, the side of the Greeks, and he is chosen to go and to fight Paris to try to get, well, basically over the I guess the ownership, for lack of a better term, the ownership of heaven. And so they go and they fight, and although, like I said, I'm kind of fuzzy because I was pretty sure that Menelaus was the one that ended up fighting Paris. Paris wasn't much of a warrior, he at least not compared to his brother Hector. Hector was the guy that everyone was afraid of. And as a matter of fact, I think it was Ajax that was chosen to fight Hector, because they were trying to find, who was going to try and fight Hector. But I don't think it ended up happening that way. There was no real one-on-one battle with Hector until Achilles comes in much later.
And I find it funny. The description of Paris is about how good he looks, but how bad a warrior he is. They say that he, if you were just looking at how people, the way he looked, he was the strongest if you were to, gauge people and size them up, but apparently he just wasn't any good at that. So
right. I mean, well, it seemed like, at least comparatively, like compared to Hector and that sort of thing.
Yeah, and maybe that's what it is.
I think he was mentioned as an archer. He could shoot a bow pretty well. That's what Paris seemed to do mostly.
Oh, and that might become important in our next story.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
But I had a little. Okay. I had a little side thought about that though, regarding Ajax and his battle, because if you remember, this was in book 7. The way they decided on who would fight Hector was really quite interesting. You notice that it said that they actually casted lots.
Yes.
And that was a practice that we know well from the Bible. It's just that I was researching it recently because I always wondered what did it look like when they casted lots in the Bible. And I found that nobody seemed to know. That there wasn't really, I don't know, we didn't know what it was, what it looked like, what exactly casting lots meant, or what it was. But they actually describe it in this book pretty well, and I wondered if it was a similar practice, because when they're deciding who's going to go and fight Hector, Nestor, who's the older knight, the older warrior that seems to be the wise man in all of this, he kind of indicates that they ought to cast lots for this. And so it actually says, and it describes the process pretty well. That was interesting to me. It's the only place I'd actually seen a primary source describe the process of casting lots. And so it says, when each of them had marked his lot and had thrown it into the helmet of Agamemnon, son of Atreus, the people lifted their hands in prayer. And thus would one of them say as he looked into the vault of heaven, Father Zeus, grant that the lot fall on Ajax, or on the son of Tydeus, or upon the king of rich Mycenae himself. As they were speaking, Nestor the knight of green shook the helmet, and from it there fell the lot which they wanted, the lot of Ajax. And that's how he was chosen to fight Hector. And so that's an interesting explanation of what casting lots meant. I assume they kind of marked some sticks or something like that, put them into a helmet and shook them and saw which one fell out. And interestingly too, just like the apostles did in Acts 1 when they were praying, that by casting lots the right apostle would be chosen, they also prayed, in this case to Zeus, that this act of chance is actually kind of kneeling down to the will of the gods. It's a really interesting idea.
Yeah, I've heard that multiple things, either from you might have heard the term roll the bones. I've heard everything from bones to almost something like a clay die.
Okay, yeah.
Dice marked certain ways. I've heard everything
Hmm.
along those lines can be used for this process. And like you said, you mark it in some way. So maybe rolling a 3 was equivalent to Ajax, something like that.
Right.
But one thing
Each person has a mark.
um, and maybe this is a decent place to speak to this.
Hmm.
Talk a little bit about the role of the gods in this book, because I found that really interesting.
Yes.
The two things I found interesting was the role of the gods and how there were complete conversations mid sword fight. That was my two big.
Yeah.
How there would be almost like how they would joke about on The Incredibles about monologuing. That's kind of what I
Right.
think when we also these battles.
Yeah. It was kind of like a comic book, how they'll be fighting and everything, but they'll still be talking pretty intelligently. It is funny, yeah. So, well, regarding the gods, though, that is the reason why this book was considering. We'll see this when we get to Plato too. He considered this book to be essentially theology. It's a book on theology. He quotes it as authoritative on the gods, at the same way that we today would quote the Bible as authoritative on God. And that's an interesting fact. And if you look at it, really, this whole story is, you're hard pressed to decide whether or not this story is about men or if it's about the gods, because it seems that you're kind of, in that sense, talking about the same thing. That the actions of the gods and the actions of men are synchronous. That they both seem to correspond in some way. But the tilt of the story is really focused on the will of the gods, and that everything that ends up happening is in some way the will of one of the gods. And that the reason, and it's funny how that actually acts out or plays itself out in the story, because you see, if you look at it from the character's point of view, I mean, us reading it, we can kind of see it from this omniscient point of view. We can see what the gods are talking about and what they want, and then we see what the people experience. But if you kind of put yourself in the shoes of, say, Agamemnon or Hector, the leaders of the opposing armies, and you've got, everyone, you've got what they see essentially is that, well, their army is winning now. Let's say Hector's people are beating the Achaeans back to their ships, and everything seems to be going well. And it's like, all right, now we're going to win. And then just for no reason whatsoever, it seems like the tide is suddenly turned, and they go back and are pushed back against the walls of Troy, and the Achaeans start to win. And then it goes back again, and back and forth, and back and forth. And it seems to them, they see some omens and that sort of thing, and it seems like they get really frustrated sometimes and think, what is it that the gods are doing here? And what you can see is that the reason it keeps going back and forth is because if you look up in Olympus, Zeus is arguing with some of the gods that want the Trojans to win, and then some of the gods want the Achaeans to win. So sometimes they kind of go down and they help, and so their side starts to win, and then Zeus will stop them and say, no, don't help them anymore. So the other side will start to win. And so it's all kind of caused by the gods, but the people can't see it as such. And there's a really important statement made by Hector regarding this whole problem. This really, I think it really shows the human condition pretty well. Because if you want to apply that practically, you can look at us and kind of see it does seem that way, that things don't seem to make sense. But the fact is, we I guess we tell ourselves this a lot, that we don't really understand the will of God as such, not perfectly. And so the question becomes, what does a human being do in a world which seems deterministic? Which means, you might have your ability to choose what you do, but it seems that to some degree that's not always the case, that there's some other force out there which determines the way events happen. And Hector was actually met with that in book 12. And they see this omen and they're like, oh no, it's bad for the Trojans now, and let's just leave or run away and basically let's go back to the city and see if we can just kind of make the best of it. And that is said to Hector, but he says something which is really interesting. And he says the particular omen that is seen is the flight of some wild fowl, this bird, and he's flying over the army, and he's got a snake clutched in his hands. So that's, as they see it, that's the Trojans having the Achaeans clutched in their hands. But then the snake, which you think is dead, actually rears up and it bites the bird, and the bird falls down from the sky. And so now the Trojans are scared. They think, oh, we thought we had him, but now maybe we don't. And so someone kind of says that to Hector, and Hector says this. He says, you bid me be ruled rather by the flight of a wild fowl. What care I whether they fly towards dawn or dark, and whether they be on my right hand or on my left? Let us put our trust rather in the counsel of great Zeus, king of mortals and immortals. And this is the quote that I really like. There is one omen and one only, that a man should fight for his country. And I thought that was that's kind of, Hector is my favorite, I think, my favorite character in this, because he's the one with the most nobility, and I would say purpose to his life, because he sees that he's kind of caught in this this battle between the gods. It's not really about them at all. They're just kind of stuck in the middle of it. So he says, no matter what they're going to end up doing, I'm going to do what's right. And so regardless of the circumstances or the consequences, I am going to fight for Troy. And so that's really why I think that's the answer, I think, to this problem of the wills of the gods seeming so, carried by the wind and something you can't really put your finger on. Throughout it, what you're supposed to do is make sure that you are doing what's right.
There was one interesting thing I found, which was, I believe, in book 21, where Achilles he's fighting against the river, and Zeus actually says he might defeat fate. And he was talking about how Achilles may be powerful enough to overcome the will of the gods. Achilles being part god himself. And I found that interesting, that they're in control, but unlike Yahweh, they're not in absolute control, which I thought was and they argue amongst themselves too.
Yeah, definitely. That is interesting, especially when you look at there was something just kind of intimated a little bit in the book. Obviously, as they keep mentioning, Zeus is so much more powerful than all the other gods. I think it was Hephaestus who was Hera's son, Hera being the wife of Zeus. She was, she's angry with him all the time, and and is always the one kind of causing trouble. As a matter of fact, there's some quote from the book which mentions the fact near the latter half of the book, where she's kind of the embodiment of chaos, where Zeus is the embodiment of order, because she's always the one that's kind of stirring up trouble with the gods, which is interesting. So
the nagging wife is what she embodies.
Right. Well, I think the nagging wife is accessing the archetype of chaos.
Possibly.
But anyway, that I think that it's interesting that Hephaestus mentions, like, I'm not going to get involved in this fight, because one time when Zeus hit you or something like that, I got real mad at him, and he threw me. He threw me from Mount Olympus, and I was falling for a week, and that's why he had a limp too. So anyway, there's this idea that Zeus is so much more powerful than the rest of them, except there was this intimation that his brother Poseidon, the king of he's called the king. He's of course the king of the sea, but he's also called the king of the earthquake, which is interesting. That he might possibly be a rival to Zeus's power, and that they try not to really have a conflict with each other, Zeus and Poseidon, because neither of them is really completely sure which one would win the fight. And that's an interesting thing too, because you have the firmament below opposed to the firmament above, and they're kind of in opposition to each other as well. That was an interesting thing. So you're right, they're definitely very powerful, much more powerful than men, but they're not all powerful. And that always leaves the possibility, even perhaps for a very powerful man, that he might somehow be able to, as was said of Achilles, perhaps even cheat fate itself.
And Poseidon becomes one. Is he the most important god in the next book, you think?
Yeah, he's mentioned the most, it seems.
Yeah.
He's definitely he's kind of the antagonist, really, the overarching antagonist.
True, yeah. But we'll get that when we get to that. My favorite character was not Hector. My favorite character is kind of odd, so we'll get to that in a minute. So what happens after this little conflict between Ajax? What happens after that? Because that was supposed to be it, right? The Achaeans win.
Yeah, well,
but that's only a third of the book, something like that.
Yeah, well, it was, which goddess was it that took Paris away and saved him from fighting Menelaus in that case, actually? Because that was what it was. It's like, we don't want to kill each other anymore. Let's just do single combat and end this right here, and we'll take Helen back if we win. And it's like, well, he was about to beat Paris, but then it was either Hera herself or, no, I think it was Athene.
I think it
was. Or was it Aphrodite? Athene? Okay, she took him, saved him, and brought him back to Troy, where he, for some reason, decided to make love to Helen again, randomly. That was weird. But either way, he was saved from the fight, and so they decided just to kind of keep fighting. That's what the Trojans decided to do anyway. It obviously was not very fair, but the gods did it, so it was kind of like, well, what are you going to do? Just keep fighting. That's essentially what happened. The rest of the book is basically the war and how it went.
So let's mention a few of the characters. We already talked about Ajax. So he was one of the major characters on the Achaean side who was quite formidable in this war. Some of the Trojans are basically only mentioned that they got killed by him. That was the
right. Yeah, that's your place of honor, is you got stabbed in the throat by Ajax.
Right. Anything else you want to talk about Hector? He's probably, if you really, what this boils down to is Achilles, Agamemnon kind of as one group versus Hector. That's kind of what the conflict is.
Yes, he basically, like you intimated by saying that, he stands alone against all of these great warriors. It's like he's the guy that can possibly defend Troy, and even for him it's really, an iffy thing. So it's kind of like he is a character doomed from the beginning, and he seems to realize that too, because he, before he goes back out to fight, he says goodbye to his wife and his son, and he kind of does it with that type of air, that attitude of, I'm probably not going to come back from this. Mm-hmm. So he's kind of doomed, but he's decided, again, that's kind of the thing that he said about the gods, where there's only one omen, which is to fight for your country, because he kind of knows that it's not going to be a very successful thing. I mean, you've got Ajax, who, by the way, is not to be confused with little Ajax. I thought that was funny. Right. There's a little Ajax too, and then a big Ajax. And Agamemnon and Menelaus and Achilles. Well, Achilles at that point wasn't in the picture. And Odysseus, and Nestor. So, I mean, it's like this massive conglomerate. It's like, imagine you, just not someone particularly famous. I mean, you're a great warrior, let's say. But it's kind of like, let's see. It's as if Mel Gibson had to fight Sylvester Stallone, not Channing Tatum, not that guy. Arnold Schwarzenegger and Brian Shaw. Just a bunch of really tough guys that we all know. It's like you alone had to fight all of these people. It's kind of that type of thing. That's kind of what it reminded me of. So you've got him kind of alone in this fight, but that makes him even more of my favorite character, because he's still willing to try and do what's right and stay. And there's something interesting he says. He knows about himself, I think, pretty well. Like, he knows who he is, and he's very confident. He's not arrogant like many of the Achaeans are, many of the characters are, but he's confident in himself. And it's interesting. An interesting thing he says when he says goodbye to his son, his baby son. It says he holds him in his arms, and he prays to Zeus. And this really, especially as a father, I started thinking about this, a father of a son, because fathers always say, that they want their sons to be better than they were. And sometimes that's an unrealistic, on some level, it's an unrealistic thing to think. If you're a guy who's like not really much of anything, and you're not very disciplined, let's say, or you haven't accomplished very much, and you want your son to be different. Well, it's really hard for a son to be different from you if you're not someone that has at least that attitude that you're going to accomplish things, Now your son can accomplish things, I think, if and perhaps a lot more than you. But that's if you instill in him the qualities which would cause him to go about and do that. So it was interesting to me that when Hector prays for his son, he says, make him as mighty and brave a man as I am. And so it's really interesting that he is transmitting that manhood to his son. And he's not someone that's like, I haven't made much of myself, but I hope he does. It's, no, I have done, my duty, and I hope that he will continue in my footsteps. So anyway, that, all those things put together, I really like Hector. He's pretty awesome.
So Hector pushes the Achaeans back to their ships. Mm-hmm. And Achilles at this point is still kind of throwing his little pity party. And
right.
Agamemnon basically is trying to get Achilles to join the fight, because he realizes that Achilles is probably worth 30 men in battle. I mean, he's that good.
Hmm.
Um,
Yeah, definitely.
and he has all of these things, including the woman that he stole.
Hmm.
I don't have everything in front of me, but it was several horses, changes of clothes, um, another suit of armor, right?
Hmm.
And
Oh man, lots
it
of
was a
stuff.
ton of stuff.
Bunch of
And
goats.
Achilles basically says you can go pound sand.
Yeah.
So my favorite character is introduced, Patroclus. Tell me what you thought of
Oh yeah.
Patroclus.
Patroclus was very. He was. I think he. Yeah, I can see why you like him best too, because he kind of was similar, I think, to Hector in some ways. Like he was very sincere. That was
Yes.
one thing about him, was he had a great amount of sincerity to his to him, and his motivations were that way too, very pure. It's like he was loyal to Achilles, and yet he also wanted to help out with the fight because he saw that it was going pretty badly, and he's the one that really tried to get Achilles to get back into it. Just forget your pride and let's see if we can save our ourselves and our friends from death. And so yeah, he really he was able, in this conflict too, he was also able to kind of stay good with both sides and remain honest at the same time.
Mhm.
So I liked him. He was very brave. He was kind of the naive type too, though, right? He was kind of, I think the
Yeah.
movie Troy actually portrayed him pretty well as far as the book is concerned, because he kind of had that sense of youthful, brave naivety to him.
Mhm. And uh, what happened to Patroclus?
He got killed.
Oh,
Hector killed him.
right. And he was wearing Achilles' armor, which was kind of a big deal. It was supposed to kind of rally the troops. And I
Right.
got the impression that it was supposed to somewhat um, get people to think that it was Achilles. That was at least the impression that I got. Um,
Yes, definitely. That it was kind of
on
a,
both
a trick. It was to motivate everyone. Yeah, yeah, and to discourage the Trojans too, to make them think, oh no, we've had all these great warriors against us and we're kind of doing okay, but now Achilles is here and it's just over. you know.
right.
So that's true. That's
And
true.
Hector kills him and takes his armor.
Yeah, yeah. Bad idea. That was one thing. For that point, Hector got kind of snooty. He was like, "Yeah, man, I'm awesome. I'm going to take your armor." He kind of threw all caution to the wind there, and he got really, his pride definitely got puffed up at that point. And of course, as we know, pride comes before the fall. So,
And the fall
and he
came in the
fell.
form of Patroclus' best friend, Achilles.
Hmm. Yes, that is the thing which finally got Achilles into the fight. That's the one thing that surprised me about the book, was Achilles was almost not in it at all. Like almost the entire time he's just sitting at the ships. Even when they come into the barricade and they're about at the ships, and Patroclus is like, "Come on, man, we've got to fight." And he says, "Okay, you guys can go and just push them back beyond the wall, but don't go any further." And even Achilles still just kind of sits there. But then finally, once Patroclus, his friend, is killed, then he decides, "All right, that's it. I'm gonna go
Right.
to town now." And he sure does.
Yeah, and
And
that's
what was it? And I remember, it's funny, they go into great detail as to how different men are killed, like where they're struck and that sort of thing. And I remember particularly Hector being killed by Achilles, because it says he threw his spear and hit him right in, that little cleft right above the clavicle, right where the collarbones meet. Stabbed right there, killed him. Nasty, awesome, very brutal.
and I found that interesting too. As a physician, there's certain areas that
Hmm.
are more prone to being injured. There's actually a
Hmm.
vessel that runs under there that's one of the takeoffs from your heart. It's your subclavian artery, and you
Okay.
bleed out really fast from getting struck there. And I don't know if
Hmm.
that was what they were trying to emphasize or what, but it was
Right.
very interesting about how the many unique ways that Achilles found to kill people between uh, joining the battle and the end of it.
Yes, definitely. And I've actually heard a comment on this before. I think C.S. Lewis talked about it a little bit. Interestingly, it was sort of, I don't know how I ran across that little conversation about it, but that a lot of people thought and have thought that the whoever it was that wrote the Iliad seemed to have seemed to have actually been in battles themselves, because a lot of the descriptions of the wounds are actually very realistic, and it does seem that way, especially definitely. Maybe, of course, the dialogue in between fighting and that sort of thing is a little bit dramatized, but I mean, I don't know, I wouldn't know. But at least the way the battle ends up going in, or happening, and the way the wounds occur, there's a lot of detail there. Like I remember another detail about Hector's wound, being struck by the spear there. It says it didn't go deep enough to, basically pierces, or to get rid of his ability to speak. It was saying that it didn't go quite that deep, so he could still talk while he was sitting there bleeding out. And I thought, well, that's really interesting that the person seemed to know at least that much about anatomy, to know that you could get stabbed to that point, bleed out, and yet it didn't go through him far enough to, I guess, kill his larynx and or stab him through the throat, in other words, and so he could still talk. So anyway, there were a lot of realistic elements to the battles, definitely.
Yeah, and that definitely makes sense of, like you said, is understanding how an actual battle's fought, and even some of the kind of formations and flanking it describes seem to that the person knew something about how a battle was actually fought.
Right. But it was kind of funny to me too how they, like, their individual tactics for fighting each other, because it did seem that they kind of well, the funny thing is, of course, I always mention the movie because you look at how in the Troy movie with Brad Pitt, how he jumps out of the ship and he goes in and he's fighting people and he is knocking people down like a ninja, just tearing through a bunch of people with 2 swords and everything. But there's not that type of fighting there. It's much more realistic. What happens is people are sitting there and they're in their chariots. They have chariot drivers, a lot of them, and they're just chucking spears at each other. Most of it was that way. It seemed like, at least the individual accounts of who gets killed by whom, very seldom is there actual hand-to-hand combat. It's just he throws this spear, it goes straight through his shield and goes into his body, and he dies. And a lot of rock throwing too. I thought that was really interesting. There was a lot of stone throwing. People pick up rocks and toss them at each other. That was interesting. So.
All right, and after Hector's death, kind of that last conflict, take us through that.
Yes, well, of course, Achilles kills Hector, and also this, I really like this quote at the time. This is in the movie too. It's one of the actual quotes that they had from the book. And when Hector is talking to Achilles before they fight, Hector says, if I kill you, I'll show you the honor of of sending your body back to your men, and not taking your armor and that sort of thing. He says, I want you to do that to me. If you kill me, I want you to send my body back to my father Priam, and let them take me and let me basically be I guess sent off to Hades. That's the proper way. And Achilles says, there are no covenants between men and lions. And he kills him. Well, for one thing, I thought it was also really interesting, and this is where you start to not like it. It's the terrible, tragic thing about Hector's character is that he's so brave and kind of honorable up to this point, and then at that point, when he decides he's going to go out and find him one-on-one, and then for some reason he decides it'd be a good idea that because he's scared, he's going to run away. And they run around the city, like, 3 times?
I believe so. And
it's ridiculous.
It's a good, almost entire, there's books instead of chapters with this. It's almost a good, half a book that they spend running around the city?
Yeah, just talking and running around. That's one thing, too. These guys had some real strong cardio because they could talk like that and still run the whole time. That's some serious fitness there. But one of the gods convinces him to stop and to face Achilles, and so he does. So I guess there's some sort of redemption there. He's like, okay, I'm going to fight him, and he gets killed pretty quickly. And Achilles does not honor that covenant, being a lion apparently, and he takes his body and desecrates it and drags it around behind his chariot. Interestingly, though, he wants to feed it to his dogs, but the dogs won't go near the body. There's some sort of holiness about the body that the dogs can sense. The gods were protecting it, basically. One or a couple of them were.
say that he wouldn't allow the body to become desecrated?
Yes, that's right. I think Zeus decided that he kind of let one of the goddesses that were fighting on his side kind of protect the body from the gods, or from the dogs, that is. So that was interesting. And then let's see. Okay, so that's actually. Oh yes. So one of the interesting things, I think eventually they do decide to give Hector's body back. And Priam, I'm pretty sure, comes down, I think in disguise at first, but he comes down and he is trying to convince him to do that. I can't remember actually exactly how that played out, but that's the basic thing that happened was, at the end of it, they did sort of convince Achilles to let them, give Hector's body back.
Right, and the book basically ends with the burial of Hector.
Right, and that is the second thing I mentioned earlier. There were two things that the movie has that I always expected the book to have, but they didn't have. The first was, of course, the taking of Helen initially, and the last was the actual sacking of Troy and the putting up of the Trojan horse and everything. It's actually not part of the book. It ends with the burial of Hector in Troy.
Right, and it's kind of interesting. It is talked about in the Odyssey, but it's not actually in the Odyssey as in like part of the story. Odysseus recounts the events about a third of the way through it, but he doesn't actually. It doesn't actually start off with that. So there's it's kind of a spoiler. The death of Achilles is not in the book, which I found.
Right.
A lot of the important events of the Trojan War kind of occur off screen.
Yeah. So the idea to me is that these stories were, or obviously there was a rich oral tradition for these stories before they're written down anyway. And the ones that were written down in this epic verse, they didn't have to include all of them because a lot of the stories they already would have known. Right. Of course, the other thing was it almost seemed a pretty abrupt ending, and I wonder if the book wasn't finished, that if they meant to write more.
Well, there definitely seems to be the Iliad and the Odyssey seem to have, kind of like Luke Acts, how there's definitely supposed to be some continuity between them, but there's enough discontinuity that that there's more to it. Does that make sense?
Yes, definitely.
All right,
I had, if you, I guess maybe we can save this to if you're fit, once you're finished with the things you wanted to cover. I had a couple of things I wanted to mention, ideas about it, but we can do that last if you want.
The rest of your comments on the book itself, and then we'll get to my final questions. Okay.
Okay. Alrighty. Well, mine were just kind of they were kind of they come from the entirety of the book. They're just different ideas that were presented to me, which were very interesting. Some are kind of random, and some are more, I guess, to the point, I suppose. One thing that was interesting was the background of Helen. We didn't really mention much about Helen as a character, but she's the central character of the thing, really. I mean, she's the reason everything's happening. Something I didn't mention about Hector was that he's the only one that treats Helen as if she's a person. There's this scene in the book where he talks to her and it's kind of like, it's okay that all this happened. I'll still go out and essentially try to protect you, even though I don't really owe you anything. I'm just going to try to do the right thing. And, they kind of have this civil conversation. And that's important because throughout the entire book, you see that women are generally speaking treated as if they have no will in any matters whatsoever. That, they, like, as we mentioned, they take women from the cities that they conquer as if they're the rest of, part of the cattle that they take and that sort of thing. Their property, in other words. And even interestingly, really crazy to me, women will be taken from a city. This warrior will come and he'll take these women and they'll be part of his harem now. And then later someone will kill this guy, and those women that were captives of him will weep over him and mourn. And it's kind of, that's how they're portrayed, as if they don't really care. They'll roll with whatever happens. and the interesting thing too about Helen was that in I always understood the story to be that Helen ran away with Paris from Menelaus, from Sparta, but it's not true. In the book it says that Paris forcibly stole her, that it really, her will had no, there was no concern for her will in the matter whatsoever. She just kind of rolled with everything, which is interesting because in the Odyssey, when she comes in, another spoiler I guess, she kind of acts as if she was complicit in the whole thing. So anyway, there's that interesting thing about Helen. But the thing about her, of course, was that she was the most beautiful woman in the world, or that she was such a great beauty that Menelaus and Agamemnon were willing to sacrifice all those men, and all those men were willing to go to war for the sake of getting Helen back. And that's a really interesting point. Of course, they were going to get some treasure out of it too, and there are others. From a historical basis, there was some sort of speculation that, of course, taking that important port city of Troy would have been good for the economy and for their trade anyway. So it was, beneficial all around. But the impetus for the whole war, which lasted, a long time, by the way. I mean, these guys were away from home on their rampages for like 9 years, it says, before they even start turning home. And the whole reason for going here to Troy was to get Helen back. And she has been such an important part of this foundation for Greek culture that, as a matter of fact, that's where we get the term, as you well know, Hellenized, or the Hellenic. Of course, that's usually referencing the Greek Empire and Greek culture, and it's reference to Helen herself. So there's something really, on a mythic level, she's very important to the history of the Greek people. It's the thing, she is the object for which they fought, let's say, and she is sort of the source for all of these songs and stories that have come down and formed the identity of the Greek people. She was the motivation for this, and that's an interesting idea. But other thing about her too is that her Castor and Pollux. I don't know if you or if anyone that's going to be listening to this know too much about Greek mythology in general, but it says that Helen was actually the sister of Castor and Pollux. I thought that was interesting because they were sons of, Castor, I think it was actually a son of Zeus and a human woman, and that woman also had a son named, I think they were twins, but they were sons of Zeus and a human woman. One of them was divine and one of them was human. And the interesting story behind them was that the human was going to die, and the divine one gave up his divinity so that he could save the life of his human brother. And so what ended up happening was this, as it actually mentioned in Odysseus and the Odyssey, there was this special dispensation from Zeus that allowed both of them to kind of continue on. And of course, they say that they're continue on traipsing through the sky together. And of course, there was a constellation of the Gemini, the twins, Castor and Pollux, up in the sky that you can see to this day. And so anyway, it's interesting. They were brothers of Helen. So Helen has sort of some connection to the gods herself, even by lineage. So that's one idea I wanted to mention. Another one was the thing that strikes me, and you mentioned this in a text to me when we were talking about the book a few weeks ago, is how much this book shows the worldview of the people that are involved in it, and especially when it comes to morality. That is what interested me about this. There's this line these two quotes that aren't very far from each other at all in book 6, and Menelaus is saying basically, Menelaus was kind of saying maybe we should yield and kind of give in to these people and kind of ease up on them a little bit. But Agamemnon's really mad at him for saying that. He says this. He says, like, there's no time for giving quarter. Then he says, let us not spare a single one of them, that is the Trojans, not even the child unborn and in its mother's womb. Let not a man of them be left alive, and let all in Ilium perish, unheeded and forgotten. And then this is what the author says. It says, thus did he speak, and his brothers and his brother was persuaded by him, for his words were just. So that's a value statement from the author about that, what Agamemnon said, which was that because of what Helen and Paris have done to you, we should kill everybody in there, even the unborn children. Let them all be forgotten. So that's an interesting thing that the author was willing to say, yeah, that was a just thing to say, and which shows you that was probably a kind of a common idea there. And so that's interesting to show that sort of, to us that's very callous and inhumane, to kill innocent children for something, some random guy did. But then if you go just 2 pages over, you get another instance of their morality, another example of it. Nestor, I think it was telling this story about some hero, and it says that it's kind of like a Joseph and Potiphar's wife type of story. It says, he says, Antia, the wife of Proetus, lusted after this guy, after Bellerophon was his name. And it says that she would have had him lie with her in secret. But he says Bellerophon was an honorable man, and he would not. So that was an interesting thing, too, that the author, or in this case, the man telling the story, mentioned that the fact that this guy wouldn't sleep with someone else's wife was an honorable thing. So you have two ideas here. You have this kind of calloused view towards human life, but then you have this really interesting idea towards the idea of, chastity and honor and, not defiling that which belongs to someone else, let's say. So it's an interesting type of worldview. And if we look at our worldview today, the common worldview in the West, it's almost completely flipped. We're very humane now, right? Like this idea of killing innocent people is just abominable to us, whereas it was pretty normal to them and even justified in their eyes. To us, that's like the worst thing you could possibly do. And yet, we don't really care about chastity at all. Like sleeping with someone else's wife, it's not the worst thing in the world. And of course, sleeping around with anyone else, that's completely normal and fine. It's actually weird if you don't do that. That's kind of the worldview now. And back then it was completely opposite. And I think C.S. Lewis mentioned this in his book, The Problem of Pain, which was that we tend to change which virtues we value more. And then when we do that, we look back at our ancestors and say that they were really dumb for not having the same value system that we are. But if you look at really the way it is both are incomplete and both imperfect, and you can't just trade one virtue for another and think that you're better. But either way, it's a really interesting thing to see the particular worldview of these people that are producing this work. Let's see. I won't go too much longer. I don't want to mention all things. There was one thing I liked about this, something that came up a lot. Well, there were a couple of phrases that came up a lot. They were kind of like refrains, let's say. One was the child of the child of the morning, rosy-fingered dawn. She was mentioned a lot. Whenever basically a poetic way of saying whenever the sun rises. When the child of morning arose, the rosy-fingered dawn. It's interesting. Dawn is personified as a woman that has rosy fingers. Never met anyone with rosy fingers before. But anyway, there was another one too, which Hector mentioned it a lot. The other men did too. I think Agamemnon said it to his men, but Hector said it, I think, the most. And it was this: he would shout to his men. He says, "Be men and fight with might and main." And it was interesting, though, the call to be men, to be, in this case, warriors. But it was an interesting phrase. I liked it a lot. Be men and fight with might and main.
Is it 1 Corinthians where Paul uses the same phrase?
Yes, that's exactly what I was thinking of.
And that phrase is a Greek idiom that has to, saying be a man doesn't just mean, have masculine features. It implies defend yourself and act heroically.
Right, because he says, "Be men, be strong." 1 Corinthians 16:13, I think it was. And as a matter of fact, it seems like it's also sort of a reference back to what was it Joab said to his men when they're fighting against the Syrians. He was saying, don't don't fear them. He says, "Let us play the men for our people in the cities of our God. Let's defend them." And that was the idea. Was basically, it's an interesting thing, the idea of manliness and manhood that is mentioned so much in this, classical literature and ancient literature, is that what it means to be a man is to be to have reached your full potential to be what you can be. And in their case, it was as a warrior, of course, because that was the function of a man at the time, was to fight, was to conquer. And so to be a true man was someone that was able to conquer in that way. And to do that, it's a really interesting and rather noble idea. Something else, I think, which we have lost, a virtue which we have almost completely ceased to talk about in
and you and I
the postmodern Western world.
Yeah, we've talked about this before, that the idea of masculinity is not like chauvinism. That is not what manliness meant to them. And acting like a man has, devolved to like the Homer Simpson type. Like that's what a man is looked at as. And it wasn't an idea of people who were the oppressors of women. That wasn't what it meant either. And
Right.
there's more nuance to the term that I think sometimes gets overlooked because of the way it's phrased,
Mhm.
because it involves being a man, but it has more to do
Right.
with the things that came from being a true hero back then.
Yes, definitely. In this book, the context is always that of well, they're not doing so well in the battle, and we need to do better, and we need you guys
Right.
essentially to be brave, to kind of do your part and to do your duty and to, accomplish the task that is given to you. So be a man and fight, might and main. It's never, because sex is mentioned quite often in this book. It's not like a major theme or anything, but there is sex in it. But there's never that idea of masculinity attached to the sexuality itself. That's just kind of something that happens. And that's the interesting thing about their idea of manhood is it's not chalked up to that function of propagating the species. That's the basic thing that anyone can do. What's hard to do is what makes you a man. It's something that you have to go out and to achieve, and that's of course, I guess, exemplified and manifested through the art of war in this case, through something which you have to train for and to work for and to be great in. As a matter of fact, uh, it is mentioned many times in this book when someone's a greater warrior, they'll say he's a better man than I am,
Hmm.
and that's the thing which is it's actually said quite a lot. Like Hector realizes Achilles is a better man than he is, and that doesn't mean, of course, that he's a better man in a moral sense, right? Because he's obviously not. It seems more that he's better at being a man than Hector is, and that's the important distinction.
All right. So the important question that we'll close with: what
Mm-hmm.
makes the Iliad a great book of the Western world?
Well, like we said before, it's definitely the foundational book of the Western world. It's the earliest one we have that has influenced us as a culture. And like we said, from Troy as an event itself, not just the book but the story. Because there's the book, but then there are all the stories which are that are kind of collected around it, the oral traditions that have been passed down even to this day, stories that we know about, but we don't particularly know any primary source that we could apply it to. But either way, it's all kind of focused around, and I guess the most important element to that tradition is this book. And from but anyway, the focus is of course on the event itself. From the event has come the Greek speaking peoples, who they are, you know, and where they came from and what they did. As a matter of fact, there's this really, really interesting line. It's in the Odyssey, and we'll talk about it perhaps when we get to the Odyssey more. But there was this interesting line about all the things that happened to all these guys when they were at the war and then when they were trying to go home. And the thing that was mentioned was that all of these things were carried out by the gods so that future generations would have something to sing about. And that was such an interesting idea to me, that perhaps all these things happened, and the way we can perceive them and the way we relate to them is the important part. Or I guess what I'm trying to say is the important part about the story is what they mean to us. Because for us, as a culture at least, and this is not so much the case with us today in the United States, because very few of us perhaps can trace our lineage really back to the Greeks. But uh, on the intellectual level, we as the West do trace our ideas back to the Greeks. And the thing about ideas is they don't just come out of thin air. They come from story. That's the thing I've noticed about, and it's an interesting thing. It's great the way that they formulated this series of books too, is because you start with myth. You never start with doctrine. You never start with ideas and these complicated theories from things. You always start with narrative. That's true for Christians too. I mean, that's true in the Bible. You don't start with, thus saith the Lord. You start with, this is what happened. And when you get from this, when you start with this is what happened, then you get down to, okay, so this is where we as a people came from. And so from these events, we can look back at them and we can deduce certain things, let's say, about God. We see God doing these things with Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. And so we can just start to say things about that. So in other words, that's where our theology comes from and our philosophy are from the stories themselves. And once we get to the philosophers in the Greeks like Plato and Aristotle, and Socrates, they're people that have really influenced us so much. And you'll see that as we get further on to the Christian philosophers like Descartes and and the others, and to Spinoza, the same time period, and see how much that these ideas affected them and how their ideas in turn affect us today. You see that it all kind of finds its origin in this book, because the basic material from which we work certain ideas about the gods and about mankind and about life come from the foundational stories. So the first thing you have is myth, and then from myth comes religion, basically the rituals and that sort of thing. And then from those come the doctrines about God and man and the world. So I think that is why this book is so foundational, because it has served as the intellectual foundation for Greek thought, which has influenced the West astronomically. As a matter of fact, as one writer, Vishal Mangalwadi, he was this Indian guy that he was a Christian apologist, and he wrote this book called The Book That Made Your World, speaking of the Bible being the foundation for the West, for the Western world. He talks about the America and the West in general being represented by an eagle with two wings. One wing, which supports us as a culture, is of course the morality of the scriptures. And then on the other wing is the philosophy and mythology of the Greeks and Romans. Those two things have made us what we are. The ideas and values that we have come from them. And so if you clip one of the wings, the eagle will fall. And what we've done in this world, or in this time, is of course clipped both of them. So we kind of have a quadriplegic eagle. Well, no. Anyway, that I think is the importance of the book. And you'll see that in the literature too. The thing is, when we get to, let's say, Shakespeare, I mean, references to the Greek gods that are mentioned in this book abound. And so if you don't really, and that's true for Milton too, when we get to Paradise Lost and Paradise Regained, and we get to Dante and the Inferno and the Paradiso and Purgatorio, like so many of these references are important for understanding the rest of the entirety of classical Western literature. So it's a really foundational and important book.
And I was going to also, Ben Shapiro makes sort of the same argument that Athens and Jerusalem that really make the West what it is. And this is definitely about as ancient of an Athenian type idea as we can get.
Right, definitely.
All right. Any other statements? If you haven't read
I think
it's good.
What's that?
It is good. It's old.
Definitely.
And if you are having trouble reading it, the Great Books of the Western World translation is a little bit old. I believe it was done in 1956. Is that right? It was something like that. There have been translations that are in a little bit more modern English if you're having trouble reading it. It might cost you a little bit more because they're probably not going to be public domain. But if that's what it takes, I think it's worth the trade-off.
Right. Now, some of the translations of these works are from earlier times too. Right. For instance, when we get to Dante, it's going to be that some of the books are harder than others. Dante was originally, of course, the Divine Comedy. It was written in Latin and translated in English by, I'm pretty sure by was it Long? I think it was Longfellow or William Wordsworth actually, who the English poet the English-speaking poet who translated this. And so anyway, it's really beautiful language in many of these books, but some of them are harder to understand than others. I thought the Iliad was okay as far as understanding it goes. Of course, I actually read it from a different, I think it's the same translation, I just had a different volume that I used, the Barnes & Noble one. Samuel Butler did this translation. I guess I'm not sure if they did the same one in the series.
I believe it is. I do know that there is an older one that is public domain that one of the things that's different about it is it uses different names for some of the gods, which can be a little bit confusing because it uses names that you're probably not used to. So I would, if you're seeing that, I would use something a little bit more up to date than that. And I talked to some of the people about how the LibriVox recordings are available if you want to listen to it in your car and those sort of things.
Right. Yeah, the problem with some of the older translations seems to be that it seems like in the 1800s and before, the English-speaking people always used the Roman names
Yes.
for the gods.
Yes.
And that's confusing because that's not what it seems like. At some point, the scholars went away from that and went back to the original. Even in our Bible translations, you'll see that the King James has, like Diana of the Ephesians, which is the Roman version of the name, and the newer translations usually say Artemis, which is the Greek one, and the one that they actually used in Ephesus at the time. So it's kind of like we've gone back from that, and that's what we're used to. So you'll see in the older ones like references to Jupiter and to Jove, when really it's like we're talking about Zeus. That's the name we would know. But
Right.
so yeah, that can be confusing.
All right. Any other
Alrighty.
closing?
No, I think that's it. That'll do. The Odyssey next time. When will we do that?
Give me 1 second.